Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Moses is fully aware that his days on this earth are quickly drawing to a close. But with a shepherd's heart, he wants to leave his flock with one last message. And it will come in the form of a blessing. The one who had led them out of Egypt and guided them through the wilderness and all the way to the land of promise wanted to pronounce a blessing over them. But knowing that the people were despondent over the thought of his pending death, Moses reminded them that their true leader was God. In Deuteronomy chapter 33, verses 1 through 5, the shepherd of Israel focuses their attention back on the one who had always been their true deliverer and king, God himself. While Moses was going away, God would be going before them. The one who had redeemed them would continue to guide and rule over them. They were not alone. This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the people of Israel before his death. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came from the 10,000s of holy ones, with flaming fire at his right hand. Yes, he loved his people. All his holy ones were in his hand. So they followed in your steps, receiving direction from you. When Moses commanded us a law, as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Thus the Lord became king in Yeshurun, when the heads of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together." Deuteronomy 33, verses 1 through 5. For his final act as the spiritual leader of the nation of Israel, Moses chose to pronounce blessings upon the 12 tribes. In a sense, this was his official last testament. God had just informed Moses that this day would be his last. He would soon be ascending Mount Nebo in the land of Moab, on the eastern side of the Jordan, just outside the land of Canaan. Once there, Moses would die at the ripe old age of 120. The Scriptures are cloaked in mystery when it comes to the details regarding the death of Moses. But it was according to God's plan and solely based on his timing. The mantle of leadership had been passed to Joshua. The people had been reminded of their responsibility to keep the covenant they had made with God. They had been warned of the consequences should they choose not to do so. And unfortunately, God had revealed that they would prove unfaithful and unwilling to keep his commands, eventually experiencing all the judgments about which he had warned them. But before he passed off the scene, Moses chose to pronounce blessings on the tribes of Israel. This is similar to the deathbed blessings that Isaac and Jacob pronounced on their sons. Moses, as the spiritual father of the children of Israel, was communicating his last testament, or will. This blessing was his gift to the people, his invocation of good. For 40 long years they had made his life miserable with their bickering, moaning, constant complaining, and stubborn refusal to remain faithful to God. Yet Moses, with a true shepherd's heart, displays his deep love for them, and his desire that they might succeed and not fail. It's likely that Moses modeled his blessing after that of Jacob, recorded in Genesis 49. And it's interesting to note the similarities between these two testaments or wills. Genesis 47 contains the details regarding the closing days of Jacob's life. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. Genesis 47, verses 27 through 28. Jacob was the father of the 12 sons from whom the 12 tribes of Israel would come. But Jacob and his sons were living in the land of Egypt when the end of his life drew near. They had moved there to escape a famine in the land of Canaan, and they had found help in the form of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who had been sold into slavery by his own brothers. During his time in Egypt, Joseph had been elevated by God from slave to sovereign. He had become one of the highest-ranking officials in the land, second only to the Pharaoh. In his official capacity, Joseph provided his family with land and employment as shepherds. And as the text indicates, they were fruitful and multiplied greatly. But 18 years later, as Jacob lay dying, he called his 12 sons together and he blessed them. They had moved to Egypt in order to escape a famine in the land of Canaan, the land of promise, but they had stayed much longer than they had planned, and now Jacob, facing death, gave blessings to his sons. Moses, facing his own death, looked on all the descendants of those 12 men and determined to offer his own blessing, But now they stood on the edge of Canaan, poised to enter the land their forefather Jacob had been forced to leave nearly 5 centuries earlier. Many years had passed, and during that time, the nation of Israel had seen it all. They had experienced the oppression of slavery and the joy of release from captivity. They had witnessed the miracles of the 10 plagues, the spectacle of the parting of the Red Sea, the provision of their needs as they made their way to the Promised Land, and the memorable moment when God appeared on Mount Sinai and delivered his law to them. Jacob had blessed his sons. Now Moses was going to bless their descendants. But before he began, he provided them with a brief history lesson. He reminded them how God had repeatedly appeared to them in the wilderness. He described the mountains of Sinai, Seir, and Paran. From these lofty heights, close to God's heavenly dwelling place, God had made himself known to the people of Israel. It was to Mount Sinai that God had descended, accompanied by fire, smoke, thunder, and lightning. From Mount Sinai, God had given his law to Moses. The Holy One had condescended and made himself known to men. He had revealed himself to Moses and shared his holy law with the people of Israel. He had made a binding covenant agreement with them, vowing to give them the land of Canaan just as he had promised to Abraham. For Moses, all of this was evidence of God's love. Yes, he loved his people. All his holy ones were in his hand. So they followed in your steps, receiving direction from you. Deuteronomy 33, verse 3. God had loved them. He had guided them. He had protected them with his hand, and he had been their king. Thus the Lord became king in Yeshurun, when the heads of the peoples were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together. Deuteronomy 33, verse 5. Moses had been their leader, but God had been their king. From the day they had left Egypt to the moment they arrived at the banks of the Jordan, God had been their sovereign king and Lord. This great God who rules in the heavens had deemed to bring his reign to earth, designating the people of Israel as his holy nation, his royal priesthood, and his chosen possession. This brief but significant reminder prefaces all that Moses is about to say to the 12 tribes. As God's leader, he spoke only by God's authority. It was essential that the people understand that God was going to continue to be their king. Moses was going away, but God would be with them. Joshua was going to step into the role of shepherd, but God would remain their great shepherd. Moses could pronounce a blessing, but only God could fulfill it. The Israelites needed to understand their complete dependence upon God. Moses was leaving them, but they had no reason to fear. God would be going before them. He would be with them, and the blessings Moses pronounced on them would be totally up to God to fulfill. Like Jacob, Moses knew that any and all blessings come from God and not men. The future of Israel was in the hands of their King and Lord.